In the early 16th century, the world was a place of vast mystery. European maps were filled with blank spaces and imagined coastlines. The great powers of the time, Portugal and Spain, were locked in a fierce competition. They raced to control the lucrative trade routes to the Spice Islands in modern-day Indonesia. Spices like cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg were worth more than gold. They were the engine of the global economy. It was in this era of ambition and discovery that a Portuguese mariner named Ferdinand Magellan conceived of a daring plan. He believed he could find a westward route to the Spice Islands, a path no one had ever successfully sailed. Magellan was a man of great experience and even greater resolve. He had served the Portuguese crown for years, fighting in battles and sailing the eastern seas. Yet, he felt unappreciated by his own king. His proposals for a westward voyage were repeatedly rejected in Lisbon. Undeterred, Magellan turned to Portugal's greatest rival, Spain. He presented his audacious idea to the young Spanish king, Charles Thorsten. Magellan argued passionately that a strait must exist through the Americas. If he could find it, he could sail across the unknown ocean beyond and claim the riches of the Spice Islands for Spain, forever changing the balance of power. King Charles was intrigued by the bold navigator's vision. He saw the potential for immense wealth and prestige. In March of 1518, he agreed to fund the expedition. Magellan was given command of a fleet of 5 ships, the Trinidad, the San Antonio, the Concepcion, the Victoria, and the Santiago. These were not grand vessels but small creaky carracks, prone to leaks and rot. His crew of over 200 men was a motley collection of sailors from across Europe. They were drawn by the promise of adventure and fortune, but many were wary of their Portuguese captain, a fact that would lead to great conflict. The preparations were long and arduous. The ships had to be repaired and loaded with provisions for a journey of unknown duration. They packed hardtack, salted meat, wine, and water, enough to last for 2 years. But no one truly knew what lay ahead. They were sailing off the edge of the known world, into a realm of myth and sea monsters. On September 20th, 1519, under Magellan's determined command, the small armada finally set sail from the Spanish port of Sanlúcar de Barrameda. They headed west, into the vast Atlantic, chasing a dream that many believed was pure folly. The journey across the Atlantic Ocean was the easy part. The fleet made good time, sailing south along the coast of Africa before catching the trade winds that pushed them west toward South America. But as they reached the shores of what is now Brazil, the first signs of trouble began to appear. The Spanish captains under Magellan's command grew resentful of his authority. They questioned his decisions and whispered conspiracies in the dark corners of the ships. The cultural divide between the Portuguese commander and his mostly Spanish crew was a constant source of tension, a powder keg waiting for a spark. As the fleet sailed further south along the unfamiliar coastline, the weather turned colder and more violent. The search for the fabled strait, the passage to the other ocean, became a grueling ordeal. Magellan ordered his ships to explore every inlet and bay, a slow and frustrating process. The days grew shorter, and the Antarctic chill set in. Morale plummeted. The crew was tired, hungry, and terrified of the unknown. They had been at sea for months and seemed no closer to their goal. The promise of riches seemed like a distant lie in the face of the harsh, unforgiving reality of the southern seas. The breaking point came during the winter of 1520. Magellan decided to anchor in a desolate bay he named Port St. Julian to wait for better weather. Here, the simmering tensions erupted into open mutiny. The captains of 3 of the 5 ships rose up against him, demanding they turn back to Spain. Magellan, however, was not a man to be trifled with. He responded with swift and brutal force. In a series of calculated moves, he regained control of his fleet. 1 mutinous captain was killed, another was executed, and 2 others were marooned, left behind on the desolate shore when the fleet finally departed. The message was clear: Magellan would not be deterred. His will was absolute, but the cost was high. The mutiny had sown deep seeds of fear and distrust among the remaining men. One ship, the Santiago, was lost, while scouting further down the coast, wrecked in a storm, though its crew was thankfully saved. The expedition was smaller and more fragile than ever. The men were now bound not just by a mission, but by the shared trauma of the brutal winter. They followed Magellan, but many did so out of fear rather than loyalty, as they continued their desperate search for the elusive strait. In October of 1520, after months of relentless searching, the remaining 4 ships finally found a promising channel. The water was deep and salty, suggesting it was not just another river. Magellan sent 2 ships, the San Antonio and the Concepcion, to investigate the winding, foreboding waterway. The landscape was stark and mountainous, and at night the crew saw fires flickering on the southern shore, lit by the native people. They named the land Tierra del Fuego, the land of fire. The passage was a labyrinth of treacherous currents and narrow fjords, a natural maze that tested the limits of their seamanship and their courage. The exploration of the strait was a nightmare in itself. It took the fleet 38 agonizing days to navigate the 350-mile passage. During this time, another disaster struck. The San Antonio, the largest ship in the fleet, and carrying a significant portion of their provisions, secretly deserted. Under the cover of a scouting mission, its crew overpowered their captain and sailed back to Spain, taking with them the false news that Magellan's expedition was lost. Magellan was now left with only 3 ships to face the vast, unknown ocean that lay ahead, his resources and manpower critically diminished. On November 28, 1520, the Trinidad, Concepcion and Victoria finally sailed out of the western end of the strait. Before them lay an ocean so vast and calm, it seemed to stretch into infinity. After the violent storms of the Atlantic and the treacherous currents of the strait, the serene water was a welcome relief. Magellan, overwhelmed with emotion, reportedly wept with joy. He named the great body of water Mar Pacifico, the peaceful sea. It was a moment of profound triumph, but it was also the beginning of the expedition's greatest ordeal. They had no idea of the true size of the ocean they had just entered. The crossing of the Pacific was a journey into hell. For 99 days, the 3 ships sailed without sight of any habitable land. They had grossly underestimated the ocean's expanse. Food and fresh water ran out completely. The men were forced to eat sawdust, leather rigging softened with seawater, and the rats that infested the ships. Scurvy, a horrific disease caused by a lack of vitamin C, ravaged the crew. Their gums swelled, their teeth fell out, and their bodies were covered in painful sores. At least 19 men died during the crossing, their bodies committed to the peaceful waters of the seemingly endless sea. After more than 3 months of starvation and disease, the desperate crew finally spotted land. In March of 1521, they reached the island of Guam, where they were able to replenish their supplies of food and water. From there, they sailed on to the islands that would later be named the Philippines. Here, Magellan found a world that was far more complex than he had imagined. He formed an alliance with a local ruler, Raja Humabon of Cebu. Magellan saw an opportunity not just for trade, but for conversion. He began an aggressive campaign to convert the local population to Christianity, a mission that would ultimately seal his fate. Magellan's zeal proved to be his undoing. He demanded that all local chieftains submit to the authority of Raja Humabon and, by extension, to the Spanish crown. One leader, Lapu-Lapu of the nearby island of Mactan, refused. Magellan, overconfident in the superiority of European weapons and armor, decided to make an example of him. On April 27, 1521, Magellan led a small force of his men to attack Lapu-Lapu's warriors. The battle was a disaster. Weighed down by their armor in the shallow water, the Spanish were overwhelmed. Ferdinand Magellan, the visionary captain who had crossed the world, was killed in the skirmish, never to complete his journey. Magellan's death shattered the expedition. The survivors, now leaderless and vulnerable, hastily fled the Philippines. The Concepcion, now dangerously undermanned, was scuttled and burned. The two remaining ships, the Trinidad and the Victoria, finally reached the Spice Islands, fulfilling the expedition's original commercial goal. They loaded their holds with precious cloves. But the journey home was still fraught with peril. The Trinidad attempted to sail back across the Pacific, but was captured by the Portuguese. Only one ship, the Victoria, under the command of Juan Sebastián Elcano, would make it back to Spain. On September 6, 1522, almost 3 years to the day after they had departed, the battered Victoria limped into the harbor at Sanlúcar de Barrameda. Of the more than 240 men who had set out, only 18 starving survivors remained. They had achieved the impossible. They were the first humans to have ever circumnavigated the globe. Though Ferdinand Magellan never saw his home again, the success of the voyage was his. His vision, his iron will, and his relentless drive had opened up the world, proving that the Earth was round and revealing the true immense scale of the Pacific Ocean. He had died in the process, but his name was forever etched into history.